think we can get started. Good evening. My name is Pamela Stern, and I'm an anthropologist here at Simon Fraser University. I want to let you know that we are filming tonight. You won't be on camera, but your voice may be if you decide to ask a question. Elder Margaret George was hoping to be here to offer us a welcome to the territories of the Halkomelem speaking peoples. Unfortunately, there is traffic chaos on the North Shore, and she was unable to even get home to get here. And so it's left to me to acknowledge that the campuses of Simon Fraser University are on the traditional unceded territories, lands and homes of Halkomelem speaking peoples, including the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. We are truly privileged to be here in this beautiful place. So this is our third annual Sonja Luehrmann Memorial Lecture presented in honor and memory of our dear friend and colleague, Sonja Luehrmann. Tonight's lecture is generously sponsored by the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, the Department of History, and many of you who may have donated to the Sonja Luehrmann Memorial Fund. We're still working towards building that endowment up so that this will be a lecture in perpetuity. And so if you are able, there's a QR code on the back of your program, and we'd be happy for you to offer us some more money to keep this event going. I would like to turn the microphone over to my colleague Travers, who will say a few words about Sonja, and then we'll move on with the event.
Thank you, Pam. Our highly esteemed and beloved colleague and friend, Sonja Luehrmann, passed away on August 24th, 2019, a little over 2 years after she was diagnosed with cancer. As an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, Sonja modeled how to live a life devoted to learning. She was a brilliant and prolific scholar who produced innovative work on religion, history, politics, and Soviet and post-Soviet Russia. It's difficult to encapsulate the breadth and depth of Sonja's scholarship in just a few words, as her work crossed disciplinary boundaries, research methodologies, and modes of writing. Among her most important contributions was her commitment to combining anthropological and historical perspectives in imaginative ways. Her first book, Alutiiq Villages Under Russian and US Rule, a published version of her master's thesis, uniquely combined an analysis of Russian archival sources, archaeological evidence, and oral histories to produce a comparative study of colonization of the Alutiiq people in what is now South Central Alaska. After receiving her PhD from the program in anthropology and history at the University of Michigan, Sonja went on to publish a second book, Secularism, Soviet Style, that drew upon archival research, long-term ethnographic fieldwork, and the analysis of images as material culture to understand the affinities between secularist movements and religious practice in the Soviet and post-Soviet era. Her third book, Religion in Secular Archives, could be read in part as a reflection on methodology, examining how archives sustain power relations and what happens when those who produce sources are different from the people the sources describe. The Society of American Archivists, which awarded Religion and Secular Archives the Waldo Gifford Leland Award, praised the book as pushing archivists to recognize the power at stake when we arrange and describe our holdings. Sonja's willingness to think outside particular theoretical or methodological constraints made each piece of her scholarship groundbreaking. My colleagues and I miss Sonja every day. We talk about her regularly, often lamenting the loss of her always deeply ethical and constructive contributions to departmental life. But we miss her friendship even more. She communicated her belief in our worth and the value of our scholarship in a multitude of ways, large and small. Throughout the past year, as you can imagine, we've talked a lot about how Sonja would have so much insight about the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. I know that this lecture series would mean so much to her, as it does to her family. And Ilya, Philip, Vera, and Lucas, we thank you for allowing us to honor and remember her in this way. I know that Sonja would be particularly excited about tonight's lecture, just as we all are. Thank you.
Thank you, Travers. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Laada Bilaniuk. She teaches anthropology at the University of Washington. Professor Bilaniuk is a linguistic anthropologist whose work focuses on language ideology, basically how we make judgments about different languages and the people who speak them. Laada is the author of numerous articles and a book, Contested Tongues, Language Politics and Cultural Correction in Ukraine, published by Cornell University Press. I've been reading some of her recent work about linguistic converts in Ukraine. These are both ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians who decided in adulthood to switch from Russian to Ukrainian as their everyday vernacular. As I was reading this work, I was just truly struck by how similar the situation that Laada was describing was like that of Quebec during the Quiet Revolution, as people re-evaluated the Ukrainian language, and in Quebec, of course, the French language, and particularly the French of the working classes, suddenly became a language of literature, of commerce, of finance, of bureaucracy. In other words, a modern, sophisticated, urban, and cosmopolitan language. Laada is currently working on a new book about the material she'll discuss with us tonight, about the social, political, and emotional work done by language in contemporary popular culture in Ukraine. So please join me in offering a warm welcome to Professor Laada Bilaniuk.
Good evening, everyone. Доброго вечора. I am honored and humbled to speak here in the memory of Sonja Luehrmann and take inspiration from her example. And frankly, it's a wonderful opportunity. It has pushed me to consolidate and grapple with some of what has been happening in the last 6 months, which I've experienced primarily through social media, news, maybe some Zoom calls, but how it is that people are surviving this incredibly difficult time. How do people find creativity and resilience? And this is just one image, making beautiful music in a destroyed central square of Kharkiv. So I won't be talking about most of what we see here, but I just wanted to bring forward what it is that people are grappling with when they make these songs or memes or the accounts that they write. And it is destroyed buildings, looted buildings, death, maiming, torture, rape, public rape, defilement, just all these horrors and tragedies that have been going on day after day for more than 6 months now. And yet, most people predicted in the West that Ukraine would fall quickly. I mean, Ukraine compared to the Russian Federation, how could they stand up to it? And yet they have. So part of it is why and how people have found the resilience to withstand this brutal assault. A few quotes here. Many people have called this a genocidal war. Why is it a genocidal war? Because the idea is to eliminate Ukraine and Ukrainianness. Putin, a few years back, said he believes that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, one nation, in fact. He said that in various ways. Other Russian political and cultural leaders have also said things to this effect. And this April, there was one treatise that was published in the Russian government news media, which, and I have a few quotes from it here. It says, Ukraine, as history has shown, is impossible as a nation state, and attempts to build one naturally lead to Nazism. Ukrainianism is an artificial anti-Russian construction that does not have its own civilizational content, a subordinate element of a foreign and alien civilization. And in this formulation, there were other various ways where they explained that anybody who wants to speak Ukrainian and have an independent Ukraine and has European values is by definition a Nazi. So it's harnessing this word in Soviet times. Anyone who defied Soviet power was a Nazi, and World War II, we defeated the Nazis. So it's this label for unequivocal enemy. And whether it has any content, I mean, you could analyze what Nazism is and probably see that in the Russian Federation, there are a lot more elements of that kind of authoritarian Nazi regime going on. Anyway, this treatise went on to say that the terms of denazification, and we can read that as meaning de-Ukrainianization, can be in no way less than one generation which must be born, grow up, and reach maturity under the conditions of denazification. And this requires the withdrawal of educational materials and prohibition of educational programs at all levels that have anything to do with Ukrainianness. And indeed, books have been burnt, new books have been shipped in, no more education in Ukrainian in the occupied territories. So, and also a lot of people have been forcefully deported out of these territories. Children have been separated from parents. People go through filtration camps to determine their loyalty and determine how the government will deal with them. So, being faced with this genocidal war, how do you withstand it? I first want to give a little bit of historical context. So what is it, how does Putin deny that Ukraine is a thing? So he denies it on the basis that there are common historical roots and that Ukraine was within the Russian Empire. So the deep historical roots, if you go way back to when Kyiv became a city-state in the 800s, probably founded by Vikings who came down, that was Kievan Rus. So this principality, and its heyday was the 800s to 1240 when it was sacked by the Mongols. But in that time, one of the princes of this Kievan Rus, Prince Vladimir, he adopted Christianity, he created international ties. That is a coin from that era which depicts the trident, which is still the current official emblem of Ukraine. And it's a descendant of this prince. The various descendants went and founded Novgorod and Muscovy, which later became Moscow, which later became Russia and the Russian Empire. So jumping ahead to the time of the Russian Empire, most of Ukraine and many other territories, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, much of Poland, Finland, Kazakhstan, Alaska, were within the Russian Empire. I've seen T-shirts now and songs which mention Alaska as that Russia's going to get them back. But anyway, in the Russian Empire, in Ukraine, there were specific policies directed against Ukrainian language. In 1804, the Ministry of Education said that all education can happen only in Russian language. In 1863, there was this Tsarist circular, and they referred to Ukrainian as Little Russian, and it basically said it never existed, does not exist, and shall never exist, and prohibited publication of books. And later there was the M's Ukaz, which prohibited use of Ukrainian in public life, so theater, public speaking, performance, that kind of thing. So there was a very specific effort to erase and negate Ukrainianness during Tsarist times. Plus you had the privileges, if you wanted to move up in society in the Russian Empire, urbanize, you needed to learn Russian. So then jumping ahead in a little bit, from various disarray to the USSR, the Soviet Union, which existed from about 1922 to 1991. 1922 it was a little smaller, and then after World War II it got bigger. But ultimately, for most of its history, it was 15 republics. That's something that growing up in the United States, I often faced. My father would often write to newspapers saying, Ukraine is not Russia. Americans, and I imagine many Canadians too, were used to thinking, oh, Soviets, Russians, that's the same thing, right? Well, anybody who studied the region would know that's not the case. Even Russia itself, the Russian Federation, as Sonja could tell us, has many diverse cultures and peoples. And certainly each of these republics had its own language and cultural tradition, its own internal diversity. And in general, I'm going to simplify Soviet history because there were the early 1920s where there was this affirmative action effort to develop cultures other than Russian. But for even then and for most of its history, Russian was singled out as the language of power, language of government, of the army, better schools, language you get ahead in. And the other languages like Armenian and Kazakh and Ukrainian were considered as having less perspective. They were rural, peasant languages, not as prestigious. If anything, especially Ukrainian had the connotations, it's good for singing and partying. Ukrainians sing and make music. So, the typical sort of stereotype of people who aren't seen as modern, urban, at the top of the heap, shall we say. Now, as we all know, in 1991, the Soviet Union fell apart. Actually, a couple years before that, all of the republics declared their own languages to be their official language before they even declared independence. And in Ukraine, there was both the struggle to de-Sovietize, and that means many different things, and also to decolonize. A lot of Ukrainians use this terminology. It's an interesting debate of to what extent Russian Tsarist and then Soviet control of Ukraine was colonial to the extent of resource extraction, but certainly with the cultural superiority and subjugation of Ukrainian language and culture. So one major trend when the Iron Curtain came down was Westernization. I started going there for research in 91 and going to concerts and things like that, and vast majority it was just trying to sort of mimic Western styles, often using English. The pop, the rock, the hard rock, all kinds of styles blended together, but not much, people weren't at that point focusing on Ukrainians. There was a smaller tendency of reviving Ukrainian culture, and often the emphasis there was on purism, that it should be an authentic, pure culture. We need to eliminate Russian elements, other elements, Soviet elements, find what is real Ukraine? And that is that question that people were facing. What is Ukraine? What does it mean to be Ukrainian? Now, the Westernization trend doesn't provide an answer because you keep Westernizing and you become Western, international. It doesn't really answer you. What does it mean to be Ukrainian? And Ukrainianization, in that purest sense and focus on history, it kind of shackles growth. It's focusing so much on what was Ukrainian before Soviets, before Tsarist interference, that it doesn't really allow for much growth. But what I've seen happening in the last 30 years in popular culture is this trend of a growing embrace of hybridity. Musicians and performers who started out maybe just embracing a Western style like rockabilly or hip hop have increasingly started experimenting more with using Ukrainian or even switching completely to Ukrainian and bringing in folk motifs, kind of turning back to the culture they grew up with and finding value in that. And this kind of hybrid creativity that modernizes Ukrainianness, it's been redefining what is Ukrainianness in a creative way that breaks through boundaries, breaks through stereotypes, and rejects established hierarchies, and kind of embraces the power. I mean, often it is seen as kind of mythical. Sometimes people are trying to undo a historical injustice, but a lot of times it's just unshackling creativity. Now, one group I don't know if anybody here has ever seen Daha Bracha. They right now are probably the most successful music group around the world. This year they even performed on the main stage at Glastonbury, and they tour all over the place. They call their style ethno-chaos. The three women in this group actually were ethnomusicologists, went to villages and collected songs. And they combine the traditional Ukrainian singing style, vocals, and instruments with international instruments and styles and rap and modern music. So if they ever come near you, go see them. It's an experience. It's sort of hard to encapsulate what exactly it is. It is kind of ethno-chaos. Anyway, they actually became popular in the West before they became popular in Ukraine. And they were very conscious of being ambassadors of Ukrainian culture. So Marko Halanevich, who's the guy in the picture, he would open the concert saying, "Доброго вечора, ми з України." Good evening, we're from Ukraine. Now, it's a very banal statement, but it was, and often he'd, bring out a flag, just sort of asserting, we're Ukrainian, we exist, we're not Russian, we're not, something else. And this phrase was then, actually a few months before the war started, sampled in an electronic composition. And so one thing I found is that these phrases that simply assert Ukrainianness, like welcome to Ukraine, or made in Ukraine, or good evening, we're from Ukraine, it's just a statement of existence. They've actually become some of these viral phrases. Actually, walking around Vancouver today, I found a poster for an event that has passed. See, we are from Ukraine. So that's the origin of that phrase, why people say we are from Ukraine. It's this viral phrase that was started by this band. And I'll play a little segment for you of this electronic composition, and you'll hear both electronic music and heavy bass beats and traditional instruments, mouth harp, Ukrainian flute, fiddle, and then you will hear the sampled voice of Marko Halanevich saying, "Good evening, we're from Ukraine." I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit here. Okay. Yes, indeed. Okay. Seeing are of traditional folk culture, right?
Доброго вечора, ми з України.
This heavy bass beat is often, this selection is used to accompany videos of war going on in Ukraine. Okay, so you get a little bit of feel of that particular composition. So it started going viral before the war started. I mean, it just in terms of views right now, there's many versions of it, but this main one has more than 15 million views. And it's interesting to look at the comments. There were over 15,000 comments, and just starting to scroll through, people use this formulation, good evening, we're from Armenia or Azerbaijan or Slovakia or Montenegro or Spain, and everybody sort of pouring in their support just in that phrase. So this is interesting, and this is the kind of thing, this sort of modernized folk Ukrainian that was frowned upon, was seen as politically dangerous in Soviet times. And even in independence, at the first years, it just wasn't done very much. Now this phrase, good evening, we're from Ukraine, or sometimes it's good morning, доброго ранку, ми з України, went viral as a saying. And one of the people, Vitaly Kim, who is the governor of Mykolaiv Oblast and head of the Mykolaiv Regional Administration, which has been, it's down in the south between Odessa and Kherson, has been experiencing a lot of shelling, but he became a sort of a folk hero because he would do his video reports. That's just one of the things you can see on the various social media channels, is these reports of what's going on in the region from politicians, political leaders, military leaders, regular people. And it became like an unofficial phrase that people start out saying, Доброго вечора, ми з України. He would actually say that in Ukrainian and then go on to do his report in Russian. Although about a month ago, I noticed that his reports started being in Ukrainian, his videoed reports. I mean, he knows both languages well. I mean, his dad was Korean, so there's also been talk, he gave some interviews where he talked about how his sort of calm demeanor was something he learned from his dad, of how you approach tense situations. Anyway, so building on this, what I'm doing here is I started with one viral song, and I'm going to be tracing the threads of memes and sayings and songs and images that have been viral that express a way that Ukrainians are coping with what is going on and how they're coping with that. So, if you look at this picture of him with the socks, I mean, one thing that you'll notice if you've watched Zelensky, Ukrainian president, since the war started, I have not seen him in a coat and tie ever. He's always in a t-shirt and sneakers. And it's this, in a way, leveling of social hierarchies. And you can see here, you know, he's got these colorful socks. So people called him the superhero in colorful socks. And there's these are just a couple of the memes. You know, Putin with his really long table. So you've got Kim sitting with him. And this picture is just from a week ago. Last week, there was the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and where Putin usually had to wait for people to come when he did his one-on-one meetings. And you'll see Putin is there sitting on a couch with Lukashenko, and I think there's also Tajik president. Kim is photoshopped in place of the Turkish president, Erdogan. So again, this is showing that, well, first of all, it's power through irreverent humor, right? But it's also showing this casual strength, you know, cutting through these hierarchies, cutting through the formalities of supposedly somebody power over Ukrainians. Now, following further with this phrase, Доброго вечора, ми з України, it was even embraced, this irreverence is embraced by the government, because a postage stamp came up with, you can see on the top it says, good evening, we are from Ukraine, and on the stamp it says it in Ukrainian, and it shows a farmer, a tractor, pulling an abandoned Russian tank. And this is a symbol of rural Ukrainian power. So Ukrainian being stereotyped as peasant and rural, but here it's embracing that, because this happened more than once, that people found these abandoned military equipment, either they had run out of, probably usually they ran out of gasoline and, you know, couldn't do anything. And farmers would tow them away, turn them over to the army, or, you know, do something with them. So this is celebrating that kind of the ingenuity and power of the farmer, the rural person. Another example of the government kind of endorsing this playful irreverence, a little bit more extreme, because if you look closely at the hand of the person depicted on the official postage stamp, it is depicting a vulgar gesture. And the series is called Русский военный корабль, иди. On the stamp, they don't say the dirty word. And in English also, they say Russian warship go ... What this commemorates is the defiance of the soldiers on Snake Island when they were told by the Russian warship to surrender. So this is Snake Island, teensy tiny little island in the Black Sea, strategically important though. And it was on the first day of the war that they were approached by the largest warship, Warship Moskva, in the Black Sea Fleet, and told to surrender. So in translation, it says, Snake Island, I, Russian warship, repeat the offer, put down your arms and surrender or you'll be bombed. Have you understood me? Do you copy? And in the recording, you hear the people saying, well, should we tell them? Yeah, and they basically say the equivalent of Russian warship, go F yourself. So this recording went viral. At first, they thought that all of the people, the 30 people or so on this island, died. There were some who were taken prisoner and did survive. But just that emblematic of against all odds. You've got a Russian warship. You're on this tiny little outpost of an island. They're going to bomb you. Do you surrender? No. You know, you are stalwart and you just face the enemy. So then, when a couple months later, Ukrainians did manage to sink the Russian warship Moskva, the postal office reissued the stamps. Some of them are missing the warship, and they say, Moskva, done. It's interesting that they use the interesting word, the English word, right? So the balance between Ukrainian is good enough to be international versus we're going to use English because we want this to be recognized internationally. So there's a bit of both of that. But again, this shows kind of official recognition of the little guy, of the defiance of the little guy. Now to keep following the thread of this particular phrase, Russian warship go. So in Ukrainian and Russian, it says to go on male phallus, right? So that's how you say this vulgar phrase. And so it's a direction. And so in the early days of the war, people were taking down street signs because they didn't want to help the enemy know where they're going. You know, they didn't know where they were going. So they actually, the road service actually put up signs telling them to go F themselves this way, again that way, and back to Russia to do it. And then there were also billboards that also celebrated that. And what's interesting here is in that particular example and on the postage stamps, Ukrainian and Russian are related, but they have about 60% lexical commonality by some counts. But the phonology is not exactly the same. And the alphabet has about 10 different letters. I mean, some are the same but have different values, some are completely different letters. So in this case, it's rendering the Russian pronunciation in Ukrainian orthography, which is a kind of making fun also. And this is another thing that came forward was celebrating the uniqueness of Ukrainian. There is more, you know, wartime and horror seems to break down the barriers of vulgarity. But not everybody accepts that. I'll just say that some people think, all right, already, we shouldn't be doing this, saying this, although this phrase just went viral. Now, Zelensky, as far as I know, so there's a euphemistic way of saying it. You can say, go the way of the Russian warship. Okay, so that's a way of alluding to it, but not actually saying nasty words. Now, following this thread of Ukrainian uniqueness, that's another thing that emerged. Shibboleths, which is a biblical term for words that reveal whether somebody is from a particular cultural group or not, if they can pronounce it correctly. So Ukrainian phonology has certain differences from Russian. So for example, palyanetsia is what you call a loaf of bread, palyanetsia. Now, the specific sounds are supposed to be hard for people who have not studied Ukrainian to pronounce. They'll usually say palyanitsa or anyway, there's various versions of it. But palyanetsia and Ukrzaliznytsia, which is Ukrainian railroad, lots of words that have this particular sound combination that people who don't know Ukrainian will pronounce well. So that became a viral meme. They have little kids with playing that they have the blogpost, the post on the road where they check people and asking people to say Palyanetia and tons of memes and things like that. So this is really celebrating that, Ukrainian is different from Russian, right? They can't pronounce, the pronunciation is not the same. And also one of the letters that is unique to Ukrainian is yi, the I with 2 dots on it. And recently I saw this image that this was chalked in Mariupol on the ground just as a sign of protest, asserting Ukrainian uniqueness. One more example of that, which is lexical, is interesting how in Ukrainian social media, whenever there's some kind of explosion in Russian territory, whether Crimea or in Russia proper, they've started calling it bavolna. So bavolna in Ukrainian means cotton. But it's wordplay because cotton in Russian is a very different word, which is chlopok. Or, yeah, chlopok and chlopok. Chlopok, chlopok. One of them is bang and one is cotton. And often, if there were explosions, people on social media in Russian would be saying, oh, there's been a chlopok. And so the Ukrainians started kind of making fun of that, saying, oh, well, you shouldn't smoke so close, or you're going to get the cotton again. And so you started getting memes that this is actually in Crimea, where one of these military facilities was bombed, and they sort of put the big cotton there. So again, this is really showing chlopok and bavolna are so different. You wouldn't know. So it's really kind of emphasizing the aspects of Ukrainian that are unique. Now, aside from language, there's other aspects of folk culture that have been celebrated, the traditional folk culture. And one thing, this actually isn't Ukrainian made, but vyshyvanka, the embroidered shirt, is one of these cultural emblems of Ukraine. And here you have a tank that stolen, or maybe, I don't know if this one was originally Russian or not, but decked out in embroidery designs. This little meme, which pixel is what the Ukrainian camo is pixelated, so kind of like digital designs, whereas Russian camo has smooth lines, so they call Ukrainian camo pixel, and this meme says, this is just an angry embroidery. The embroidery has kind of gone crazy and angry. And also embroidery designs that commemorate or kind of grapple with or incorporate into the narrative the war that Ukraine is facing, in this case with NLAW, arms. I guess the upside down people at the bottom would be dead soldiers and tanks. And here is another one, which is the life-affirming Bayraktar tree. So Bayraktar, and there's also a viral song for Bayraktar. Bayraktar is a Turkish manufactured drone that has been widely used by Ukraine and other countries. I don't know whether all the Baltic countries or some of them, Latvia, and other countries have fundraised, crowdfunded, in order to buy Bayraktar for Ukraine. And then the Turkish company, rather than making them pay for them, actually donated them. And Ukrainians have also fundraised for that. And so this looks like kind of the Bayraktar. So again, this is a embroidery design that commemorates the Bayraktar. And here's one last embroidery design. This is actually acrylic paint, but it's a different style of Ukrainian embroidery. And again, you can also see that it has the guy with the javelin and the tanks, and it's kind of fighting back with folk art, saying, this isn't destroying us. We're still creating and persisting. Ukrainianness is persisting. It can handle all this. Okay, going another direction into folk art, there's this one case where a building that had been bombs exploded near it twice, where the kitchen cabinet hung on. And so this is a close-up of that kitchen cabinet, and it's actually got the plates still in there. And I'll show a close-up later. There's a little rooster picture there. And, this one guy posted, said, "You want to know how we're feeling in Ukraine? Like this shelf. Russians try to break us, but we're holding on, and we will hold on to victory." And this became another meme that people have drawn saying, "Hang in there," or "Ukrainian culture is unbreakable," because this little picture up here is in this particular folk art pottery style from the town of Borodyanka. And so it's kind of, again, celebrating folk art and combining that with an idea of Ukrainian culture being strong. There's also the power of folk beliefs, specifically witchcraft. Often the witchcraft and magic is combined also with some Christian invocations of God, but the Konotop witches in central northern Ukraine, there's this folk tradition that with half of the women there are witches, and so when NATO would not close the sky, not help police so that Russian bombers can't go in Ukraine, you have this meme which says just "Дівчата, закриймо небо," girls, let's close the sky, that the witches will do it. And also in this particular meme, you have the tanks with their wilted shooting tubes, I don't know what they're called, and it also says that, statistical data say that in Konotop, every other woman is a witch, and this means that the men's thingies will dry up, and basically saying that woe to the Russian invaders that come into this area. Another poem that went viral by Ruslana Horova, she actually wrote a curse invocation and in Ukrainian. So roughly part of the translation, which was then picked up by people, performed vocally in different styles, even in sort of pop music style. Basically, it says, "I sow in your eyes," like sowing grain. "I sow against the night. It will be for you, O enemy," as the witch says. "How many rye grains fell into the holy earth? So many times you, the enemy, will die. How many times, O enemy, the rooster crows at night? So many days you have to live out your life." And then later, "However many steps, O enemy, you take in Ukraine, so many of your kindred shall lay down in the grave." So in Ukrainian, this is "Bude tobi vraže, tak jak vidima skaže." And another thing is, so the vraže, like in Russian vrag, in Ukrainian the nominative is vorokh, but Ukrainian has a vocative case which Russian doesn't have. So again, saying not just vrag or vorokh, but saying vraže is uniquely Ukrainian. So this happens a lot in this composition. And so, the picture on the right, the woman who is made up like a motanka doll. So these are traditional dolls. They don't have a face depicted because of ideas that depicting a face kind of captures the soul. But these are sort of good luck protectresses of a household of Ukraine. And so you had people using the theme of this poem and dressing up as different kinds of witches and posters for T-shirts. So you have this kind of development of this idea of this folk power in the witchcraft that went viral. Now, I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. So while that was a very specific cursing, there is also power in more sort of lyrical folk culture. And the Czerwona Kalina, which is either, you can call it European cranberry, Gilder rose, Viburnum opulus for those who know that kind of terminology. It's what it looks like, and it is often used as an emblem of Ukraine. And back around World War I time, before Ukraine was ultimately incorporated as a Soviet republic, this was the hymn. There was a short-lived independent Ukrainian republic between 1918 and 1921, 22, and this was the hymn of the army of that republic. But the lyrics, so the melody dates back to World War I era. The lyrics are actually older and date back to the 17th century. So this song was sung by Andriy Livniuk, lead singer of a group Boombox, who was touring the US when the war started, and he quickly abandoned his tour, came home to Kyiv, and joined the territorial defense. And he posted this video on his social media, which I'll show you a very quick clip of, and here are essentially a translation of the words. And he's now in central Kyiv.
Чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася, а ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну хе-хе розвеселимо.
So this is touching in many ways. First of all, it is again showing a sort of breakdown of hierarchies because for such a long time, it was seen that people who have more privilege, aren't with the little guy. Here is somebody who is a rock star and was in the West and came back to stand up to serve his country. This was when Kyiv was being attacked. He did get a little bit of a wound on his face, but nothing too serious later. But him singing this song a cappella also shows kind of this power. And this song ended up going viral, being picked up. First, it was South African artist, the Kifness. He riffs on his name by calling himself the Kyiv-ness. And he sampled, he took Livniuk's recording and then built other instruments onto it. So you can look that up. That's a very cool video. In Tallinn in Estonia, where you have this tradition of choirs of thousands of people getting together, a choir got together to sing this song. Pink Floyd, who had not recorded a new song for 30 years, got together and recorded a new song, Hey Hey Rise Up. So also including Andriy Livniuk singing and adding their sort of guitar to that. And so this was this international support and recognition. And also, this little kid is in Ukraine, but everybody was singing this song. This became a very unifying piece of folk culture, although if you look at the lyrics, they're very non-aggressive. This isn't like a witch's curse. This is just, in the meadow, a red kalina has bent down low. For some reason, our glorious Ukraine is sad. We'll take that red kalina and lift it up, and we shall cheer up our Ukraine, hey, hey. And it's essentially just a very sort of simple, optimistic song. So what was interesting here is not only that it gave this bit of folk culture that kind of cycles back to an older historical time, gave strength to people and unified people, but also it was very empowering for Ukrainians how the international community also supported them. And in popular culture, to have the legendary Pink Floyd saying this was also, a big deal. The Ukrainian anthem is also something that in the early days there were many symphonies and opera houses all around the world that performed the anthem in solidarity with Ukraine. Because as much as Ukrainians are fighting for their lives, for their freedom, but they do need Western arms and support. They did not develop their military arsenal to that extent. Actually, Zelensky, if anything, President Zelensky he campaigned on trying to end the war. And he grew up as a Russian speaker. His video campaigns show him, he doesn't hide the fact that he's trying to learn Ukrainian better. He works out, and then if he doesn't, and his trainer tells him like a Russian word to translate into Ukrainian, and if he gets it wrong, he has to do pull-ups and vice versa. I mean, it was pretty funny about this. Now, however, both the fact that when the war started, supposedly the West offered him an escape route, and you may have heard this phrase that he said he needs arms, not a ride. And So him staying with the people, performers like Andriy Livniuk, and there's many others, and some who unfortunately have lost their lives, dancers and singers and actors who have joined based on their skills, territorial defense or volunteering or the army. And so this kind of empowerment from the national community has been very important to Ukrainians as well. So to conclude here, taking all of these kind of different threads, actually I'll jump ahead. I love this little meme, which now that the war has been going a little bit better, it shows this granny unraveling the Russian tank. You know, this is kind of this emblem for the power of the little guy. But pulling this thread, essentially this is what I've been trying to do, is to weave together, to find the threads that connect the many different songs and sayings and memes and what it is that they tell us. And so part of the big picture is that if anything, this war has done the opposite of what Putin and others in the Russian government wanted. It's pushed Ukraine away from the Russian sphere of influence. And really this war started in 2014 when the corrupt Ukrainian president, who was kind of in cahoots with Putin, he fled, the people weren't having it, but Ukraine was just down and completely disorganized. And that's when Russia sent in troops and took over Crimea and fomented the unrest and separatism and took over parts of the Donbass, the east. And that moment, 2014, is what many Ukrainians feel as a sense of betrayal. Up until that point, it was like, well, we are brotherly countries. Yeah, why not? Okay, there was resentment of, you know, being treated as the little brother, but Ukrainians are very widely bilingual. And it's interesting, even now, that on the media, you can hear people speaking both languages, although more people, especially in official roles and performers, are making the move to switch to Ukrainian. It's not that hard to do. It's like Spanish and Italian. You need to learn a little bit, but it's not that hard. But one reason why people would say they wouldn't bother is because of the disdain, that it was something, why bother? If you're going to learn another language, it might as well be English, right? But this war and their ability to stand has shown Ukrainians that their culture and language has power, that they're not just second-rate peasant little brothers to Russia. And it is a form of decolonization. A lot of Ukrainians use that term for what they see happening as a decolonization of mentality, to not see oneself as being somehow lesser. Now, while it has pushed Ukraine away from Russian language and culture in Russia, at the same time, it has really united the government and the people, which is kind of unprecedented, because when the Soviet Union fell apart, the privatization, which they called prihvatizatsiya, the grab everything you can, which made some people ultra-rich and poor people even poorer, and this embrace of westernization, where it was all about the Gucci, Dolce Gabbana, Lamborghini, you have it, the emblems of Western high culture. It's kind of cut through that, because you have people who fighting in the army, IT workers and cab drivers and teachers and factory workers, kind of all together in the same boat, fighting for their country. So it has erased many boundaries of language, region, and class. And ultimately, it is giving, I guess this is the silver lining, as I showed those images in the beginning of the horrors and the tragedies. But ultimately, it's been this breaking point where it's pushing Ukrainians to new cultural creativity and to kind of realize what they have to lose. And I'll just conclude on this image, get back a little bit to the humor or the calm. There have been lots of pictures of unexploded bombs in people's living rooms, on the street. And in this one, you have a guy, doing yoga next to this bomb, and he's an actor who visited Kharkiv to take the photo. And according to him, this is how he decided to draw the world's attention to the conditions where civilians have to live, especially in eastern Ukraine, and also remind Ukrainians that it's important to take care of their mental and physical condition at any time. So this is kind of the reality that Ukrainians are living with, and the fact that they can help each other to live with it is an incredibly powerful act. That said, there are a lot of people who are dealing with and facing deep trauma. So, it is still a struggle, these memes and stories. There are also stories of horrors and heartbreak, but I guess I'd say, especially in terms of withstanding Russian authoritarianism, humor is very important. Humor exceeds the bounds of authoritarian control, and the ways that people can make fun of themselves and of social hierarchies that oppress them is very empowering. Thank you.
So we have lots of time for some questions because I see the food hasn't arrived yet. So I hope we'll get a lot of questions. And I will zip in the back and phone them and tell them it's time to bring the food. But we have a microphone. If you would like to stand at the microphone and ask questions. And I have a question. I don't know if it's a question or what the question is exactly, but I found it.
That's the kind of questions I usually ask, so yeah.
I was struck by the irreverence of the government in the postage stamps and that elite production, that official production of vulgarity. And I just wonder if you could just unpack that a little bit more?
Yes, definitely. It is, on the one hand, shocking, but on the other hand, what is happening in Ukraine is shocking. And especially the phrase Russian warship "Иди нахуй" was so emblematic of the situation, where you have Ukraine, if you look at the map, it's this little guy against, it's a David and Goliath situation. And it really united people, and that phrase went viral, as you saw, on signs and on posters. And ultimately, that was the first stamp. It came out before the Good Evening, We're from Ukraine stamp. They had a competition to design the image. So the image is also crowdsourced, but yes, it is somebody in the administration who made that decision. And in the words, they do elide the dirty word. But you're right, in the image itself, that is a vulgar gesture. I think it's in a way appropriate in a desperate time. And even in the 2014 protests, there was some of that kind of vulgar use of language. Vulgarities are powerful. It's just a combination of sounds, but boy, it packs a punch. And so, in a way, it's harnessing that power of the word, of the gesture. Even if they may not have enough bombs, they've got the spirit and the gesture that depicts it. So I hope that helps address it a little bit.
And as you're speaking, it occurs to me that I'm remembering Madeleine Albright, who was an American Secretary of State, using a mild vulgarity to talk about Fidel Castro. And I mean, part of why it worked with her because she was a woman, but and so we could be a little shocked.
Yeah. Well, usually this is something that is seen as being part of uncivilized, uneducated, uncultured. So part of this is also saying, well, the heck with your civilization and culturedness. There is also another saying and theme that went viral, and it is a local businessman farmer who put forward a video, and he's also owner of a regional soccer team, and he speaks sort of heavy dialect with Russian borrowings and full of expletives. But it was this heartfelt speech where he's talking to Vova, which is a nickname for Volodymyr, like Zelensky, saying, you know, I didn't vote for you from the first round, but I'm behind you now. You're sticking it out here, not like those others, you know, top leaders who have left. You know, I see all their cars in the airport parking lot. And he says that what Vova should do is, okay, a very mild way to say it is to give him hell. But it's really like, F the heck out of him. And so he says, Vova, yibash ich blaj. And we're going to help you. So I apologize for those of you who understand that vulgarity. It is very, very vulgar. But this video of him talking was then also sampled by electronic musicians and turned into this whole boppy song. And then there was another video where just driving around town, these guys would open their window and yell out to people waiting for the bus stop saying Vova, and the people would call back. So it became this call and response thing. So it's really, you know, sort of solidarity building. And even though you're transgressing, but it maybe makes you feel like you're fighting back somehow, you know, even if you're not packing a punch physically. So when Zelensky, who follows memes and things like that, referred to that, he just said, and I know, you know, you guys with the song that says Vova, you know, he would not say the vulgarities which I just uttered, because, you know, I guess there are still some limits with uttering those kinds of obscenities. So perhaps that means, but you are right, this was the post office that put out that stamp. So the boundary was a little bit pushed. But they showed the gesture, not the words.
How do you see this as ending? What's your perspective?
How do I see the war ending or the cultural developments?
What's happening right there right now? What is going to be the end?
Deep sigh. Well, what Ukrainians are seeing is happening in Russia with the curtailment of freedom of expression, and also with non-Russian languages. In 2018, Russia put forward a law saying that nobody is required to study anything other than Russian. So even in republics like Tatarstan or Sakha, Yakutia, if you don't want to study the official second language of that republic within the Russian Federation, you don't have to. And when this law was put forward, there was even an Adige man who self-immolated in protest of this. Because for minority languages, you need that official support. You need that institutional support. So for Ukrainians and for minorities in Ukraine, like Crimean Tatars, they see that becoming part of Russia isn't really a life. If you want to have freedom of expression, and if for some reason you want to be Ukrainian. And, you know, why shouldn't they be Ukrainian? I guess for some people who maybe didn't care one way or the other, the impression was forced, especially the areas that have experienced Russian occupation. Those are the places where there's the highest concentration of people who speak Russian at home. And yet, their houses were looted, taken over, they had to live in their basements, and experiencing far worse things than that, torture, execution, rape. So with the people in occupied territories, either if they embraced Russia, which some people did, But even those areas, they had a lot of people had everything taken away, like everything taken in their house, even underclothes, from what people say, that they're just everything looted, and refrigerators and washing machines is one of these things that people said, and that a lot of the Russian soldiers who have been fighting are from areas that aren't so well off, and Ukrainian, even many of the villages are decently well off. They have running water, they have electricity, they have washing machines, they, basics of life. And so there's also this resentment. So I'd say that even the Ukrainians who have native Russian language, many of them changed their attitude about whether they would be okay being part of Russia or not. So for many Ukrainians, this is a fight for their very existence and a fight to the death. Now, is it going to be a fight to the death? Because Putin hasn't, well, he has used up a lot of his bombs, but apparently not the nuclear bombs. And just out of resentment or desire to wipe out Ukraine, that could happen. But I do see Ukrainians continuing to fight, and I think they have a chance in part because they have something to fight for. What is the Russian side fighting for? Well, there may be some people who are somehow ideologically convinced that they are, doing their patriotic duty, but for most people, it is financial need. Right? Most of the people who have enlisted in the Russian army did it for the money. Yes, they're given tons of propaganda about how they're fighting Nazis, So, and I have heard indeed that some people feel like, here in Buryatia we live peacefully together. Those Ukrainians, they can't, why are they so impossible to live with? So there is that ideology, but I think there's more, Ukrainians have more to fight for. They're fighting for their homes, for their houses where they may have lived for hundreds of years, as opposed to coming onto somebody else's territory. So I think there is a chance that Ukraine will survive and regain much of its territory. How much of that, I don't know. But making predictions, who knows if Trump will yet get reelected in the United States. And there's certainly, as much as statistics show that people in Ukraine have less favorable, less supportive ideas about Russia than they did before the war, much less so. Statistics seem to show that in Russia there is a lot of support for the war, although it would be interesting to see, because I'm always interested in influence of popular cultural figures. So Alla Pugacheva, who is like the diva of Russian pop culture, and her husband, Maxim Galkin, who I think lives in Israel right now, but he's been critical, and he was announced as being a foreign agent. And a few days after that, she came forward and publicly said that she is against this war and that she should be declared a foreign agent as well. So it'll be interesting whether that influences the Russian people. And there certainly are Russian people who would, or even coming to fight on the Ukrainian side, who would like Russia to be democratic and have freedom of speech. A lot of, I don't know if you've seen the Russian flag without the red stripe, just with the blue stripe. So there is a movement for a free and democratic Russia. That would be the ideal, because I think that would be the best for the citizens of Russia as well. But I will try to be optimistic, like many of the memes.
As you know, Canada has a substantial population of people who take great pride in their Ukrainian ethnicity. And there are, in fact, communities, particularly on the prairies, that identify as Ukrainian. I'm wondering if you have seen comparable creative responses by these communities to the current political situation, and perhaps in the U.S. also.
Yeah, so I guess I don't know enough about the responses. I have driven across Canada and visited some of these communities. Alberta is a phenomenal outdoor museum where some of these the early habitations of the Ukrainian settlers are preserved or recreated. And so as far as the response, I know that in the Seattle area, the various communities have been both helping with fundraising, helping with just accumulating medical supplies, filling shipping containers, shipping them over to Poland, getting them into Ukraine. Also, some people I know have actually gone to volunteer. I do hope to go next summer. I'm not going to go to the front line, but in much of Ukraine, although the first days of the bombing kind of reached everywhere, but right now Western Ukraine and even Kyiv is relatively safe, and there's a lot that needs to be done, both in preparing supplies, getting them to places, but also working with kids, with people. So that is one way that the Ukrainian diasporic community is helping, so both financially and with supplies, and also in welcoming refugees. So people, Ukraine's population before the war started was about 42 million, but now there are millions of people who have been internally displaced and left the country. And for the most part, it's women and children, because men between the ages of 18 and 60 can't leave unless they have at least 3 children, or there are, some other short-term options. But so it's not a permanent exodus. Most people want to go back and rejoin their family.
Yeah, I was wondering, have you met any of the women who have come as refugees in the United States or anywhere else?
I have not yet met any of the women who have come as refugees. I have encountered some of them online, and so some of the things that they face, Seattle maybe isn't quite as expensive as Vancouver, but the Seattle area, you get housing maybe for a few months, but if you don't have a car, it's hard to get around, and getting a job. So there are huge challenges, and also challenges with language. But I know that some of the people who are already there are working on sort of creating daycare opportunities for the people who have kids.
No, let me finish the question.
Oh, sorry.
I was asking in terms of, because war is a video factory, in a sense. A lot of Ukrainians are also dying while their spouses or their parents are in exile or refugees. Because the ones I have met, they feel that they have lost everything, including their spouses. So in terms of while it's entertaining to have all these jokes, but at the same time, the future of the women who have children who have left the country, what is their future?
Right, well, I guess there are many futures, and it will in part be up to them. I remember reading an account of a woman who's facing serious depression, and she's living in eastern France right now, and her children are going to school. There is a lot of need for psychological support. That part of the world in Eastern Europe, notoriously issues like depression or psychological health was not really a developed and recognized field. Even postpartum depression, I was like, pull yourself together, that's not a thing. Now people are starting to recognize that there is need to mobilize, to learn, to help people to overcome the tragedies. And for people who have been displaced, I don't know the legal dimensions of how long they get to be away. Some people have indeed lost their houses. There's nothing for them to go back to. Right now, the Ukrainian government is still fighting the war, but they are also already planning about how to rebuild. In the areas that aren't being shelled, places are being rebuilt. Volunteers are coming out and at least helping people to have some kind of space where they, if they at least have like a garage that didn't get bombed out to insulate it, so they have some safe place because winter is coming. A lot of times people's houses who they invested their life's work and savings into are gone. And yes, the people who do have spouses or sons or daughters, since 20% of the army are actually women, are the lucky ones. So what is the future for them? Well, it depends on how long this war lasts and whether the Ukrainian government, with international support, is able to rebuild enough so people who want to come back can come back to the country that they know. Although the West, even recently, has still had this aura of everything's better in the West. There's less corruption, you get a better job. So some people may embrace that. If they've lost everything, then it'll be kind of like my parents and grandparents who came during World War II. They fled the Soviets, they were in displaced persons camps in Germany for 5 years, came to the US with nothing, and figured out how to make do. That's why I speak Ukrainian, because my grandparents never really learned English, and they were the daycare at home. So I guess there's different paths, and both the diaspora community and I know other people who aren't Ukrainian diaspora have been incredibly supportive in helping refugees. So I guess there's those two options. As somebody who was born in the United States but grew up valuing Ukrainian culture, you sort of straddle two worlds, and that's what the diaspora does. So people who have survived tragedy and moved to a different country may choose to continue their life as a person in the diaspora.
The media is not allowed to go to the war front or any international media. And so I was wondering that the women and children who are outside as refugees, how do they communicate with their spouses? And if the spouses die, do they get information or is hidden from them?
So if your spouse or other family member dies, if you are lucky, then their body is recovered and you are notified. Unfortunately, there are people who are disappeared, and even in the mass graves that have been found, not all the bodies have been identified. There are others who it's not sure if they were taken prisoner or hostage and taken into Russian-controlled territory. As far as communicating with people who are on the front, that is also tricky because cell phone signals will give away your position. And yet, people do make video missives, which they share. So I've been following a lot of like the Telegram channels or the social media channels. So there are people at the front who make videos and get them out to their family members. But it's certainly, there are a lot of people who haven't heard from their loved ones. And the worst is if they don't even know where they are. Because Russia is not giving complete lists. And as I'm sure you've heard, even the prisoners who were in one of the prison colonies in the occupied territories were essentially killed by an incendiary bomb, and Russia tried to pass that off as it being a hit from the West, but all the research shows that that wasn't the case. So people are facing incredible loss, both of loved ones and of their livelihoods. Children, hundreds of children have been killed or maimed. So it is a very desperate situation, but what is amazing is how people are finding it in them not to give up. And ultimately, I know for me, even though I did all this from a distance when the war started, just going in and teaching about it, explaining it to my students was therapeutic. And what I've read about people who are experiencing this, donating, volunteering, it helps if you can do that. Now, not everybody can do that, and especially people with small children, parents, facing the air raid sirens. Not everybody can step up to that. So there's the other side of volunteering, which is finding the people who haven't left or wherever they have left and just supporting them in any way possible. So this, in a way, has broken down a lot of barriers between people that have been helping each other in any way they can. Well, this is kind of my first attempt, and I have seen in the past 6 months, following these various media, images that I don't usually see in American media. The horrors of war, very close up, because people do post that. And for me, it's kind of torn between witnessing and not wanting to look. And so I am torn up about that. And I haven't been back in Ukraine for 3 years now. So I acknowledge that I have this distance and that I've experienced all this virtually, not physically. Last time I went, the war in the Donbass was ongoing, and it was very interesting that in Kyiv, life was going on as normal, restaurants, but there were places where they had these rusted silhouettes, either of a business person or a soldier shot through with a little placard saying, remember, because they are fighting for you, you're able to enjoy yourself here. So there are little reminders, and especially in the central square as well, where every week there would be a funeral for somebody who died. So there are these reminders, but in a way, even me being distant, but a few years ago when I was in Kyiv, it's like, well, life goes on. And what some of the people who are on the front have said is, it is important for life to go on, but balance that with recognizing and giving due to the people who are making that life possible for you. So how to balance that? I mean, the way I presented it here, and what in a way amazed me, is how people can go from seeing dismembered bodies to making a joke. Perhaps it's like surgeons who are doing life and death operations. You have to dissociate yourself to some extent and perhaps have a sense of humor just to be able to function. And again, this is new territory for me psychologically, how humor helps or doesn't with trauma. That is new territory. And then frankly, that's something that many Ukrainians have to be figuring out, because there are so many people who have experienced extreme trauma. And things like rape, for example. I mean, I'm of the generation of here where in the 80s we had Take Back the Night. Young women came forward on campus to talk about their experience of rape, or just to demystify it, to find empowerment together. In Ukraine, there's still and I know a friend of mine, she was like, I would rather die, right? How do you convince somebody that it is worth living, even if you've been raped? That you don't give that power to that act? And that's a very difficult question. And it involves a change in society with, I guess how that violence is viewed and how people live with violence. I mean, one thing is definitely in the past years, there's been more awareness of equality for people with disabilities, making stuff accessible. Because in Soviet times, there were no ramps, or if there were, they were ridiculously steep and inaccessible. And now, at least in cities, there's been more attention to that. And now, all of a sudden, so many more people have disabilities with lost limbs or things like that. So maybe in the long run it'll make society better for everybody. But it is a long haul. So even with this, although I showed that meme with Vitaly Kim in place of Erdogan, which was recent, but I have seen after that initial explosion of culture, it has tapered off in the last few months, just in the quantity of songs and things that were being put forward. And I brought forward the ones that were more viral in the social media. There's many others where known musicians, did songs in honor, to raise funds or things like that. So there's a lot of that going on. But the big question will be the long haul and what it means when people are freezing. But I don't know how. I'm going to be figuring that out. Maybe we can talk about strategies for how one teaches and does field work in situations of widespread trauma.
So let's make this the last question, and then hope everybody will join us for some refreshments and a cash bar as well.
To what extent is this creative resistance impacting the collective conscious of Russia? Is any of it getting in, or how much? Because I know it's pretty hard. How much of it is influencing like some of the people?
That's an excellent question. So I have not been following Russian social media as much. I do know that in Russian-occupied Crimea, people who played one of these songs, I think it was Chervona Kalina compositions that they were dancing to, that video then essentially got them arrested and fined. It was a wedding. So certainly in public, it is problematic, but I don't know how much people are accessing, because Telegram, that social media service, I think still operates unrestricted in Russia, whereas Facebook and Instagram and others have been shut down. So presumably people do have access, and yet I have also heard of young people in Russia going to jail overnight just for holding up a blank sign, when the war started. That there is, it'll be interesting to see if and when a tipping point can happen, where more people would come forward to say, hey, we don't want this. Now, just today, Putin announced mobilization, that may be more of a tipping point. Alla Pugacheva speaking out against the war, that is huge. So cultural figures which are respected. So I'm hoping that more of that can happen. And I know that, there's been Russian rap that is defiant of social structures, and they get variously fined. But yeah, I don't know enough about how much of that creative ferment is echoing in Russia. But that would be really interesting to find out. And how do you find that out without putting people in trouble? Thank you for listening. Thank you.